Transport Scotland. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, just want to cover off one more piece of housekeeping. As Nez mentioned, we've got the chat function. We're going to be delivering tonight's session in two parts. There'll be the presentation itself, which will last about 45 minutes. And then following that, there'll be a 30-minute Q&A session. So if you've got any questions that you want to ask throughout the presentation, please just post those onto the chat line. And of course, we'll pick those up after the presentation itself. And if everyone could throw themselves on mute, that would be magic, just so we can avoid background noise. In terms of tonight's speakers, I first met Kate and Don earlier this year as part of a leadership course that I was on. And, they delivered a session that was titled much the same as tonight's, challenging the traditional approach to setting strategy. And if I'm really honest, I was a bit cynical joining in. I thought it was going to be another session that would repeat all the things strategies normally have in them: vision, mission, values, objectives, outcomes, etc. And I'm happy to say that I sort of left this session absolutely inspired and with a fresh and new perspective on setting strategy. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they've got to say tonight. One thing Robbie didn't mention at the beginning there was that Kate and Don have offered to run tonight's session at no cost, which is absolutely superb and warmly received. So I'd just like to make that point at the start before I begin introducing them both. In terms of Don's a bit of a strategy legend. So Don currently works at the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow and has published research on strategy and strategic management that has received international recognition and praise. Kate is a former senior BBC producer leading content and communication teams in the public and academic sectors. The two of them have joined up and they've launched a very successful business strategy story, which in essence looks to bring together the two worlds of strategy and storytelling. So Kate and Don, once again, thank you very much for making the time to be here, and I'll hand on over. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Trafford. Can everybody hear me all right? Brilliant. If I get too excited or go too fast, just somebody send me a wee signal to slow me down. We've got quite a lot to get through. It's a great honour and privilege. I'm speaking for both Kate and I when we say to be asked to do this, so we're delighted. We've done quite a lot of Zoom work, but we are still feeling our way into it, as no doubt are many people. So, you know, if there is the odd technological glitch or whatever it is, please forgive us. We'll do our very best. And if I disappear because of Wi-Fi or something like that, be assured that I will be trying to get back, as I'm sure Kate will, and Trafford or Niamh or somebody else will take over the session for us. So, where are we going to go? So, a non-traditional approach to strategy. Strategy is one of these words. Gets everywhere these days, means a lot of things to a lot of people. I have to say, like many things that have been grabbed by academics, it's been ridiculously overcomplicated. It's actually a really simple set of ideas. And before we start presenting too many non-traditional approaches, what I thought it would be useful to do is to talk through, just quickly, what we actually mean by strategy in the traditional sense, because even that has been kind of twisted out of shape a little bit. So just to get us all on the same page at the start, say a wee bit about traditional strategy. And then we'll go into kind of this is going to twist your mind a little bit, a non-traditional approach to traditional strategy. And then we'll go into a traditional, non-traditional approach to non-traditional strategy. We'll end up somewhere like that. Okay, so Kate and I met, you can see the thing in the background. In fact, behind me, it's the same, more or less same beach. It's on the front slide there, which hopefully everybody can see. It's on Harris. The business was born in the Outer Hebrides. And part of that is, the reason I'm telling you that is that part of it was that people don't really believe this. They kind of look at you skeptically when you say it, but until a few hundred years ago, social order or patterns, what a lot of people now would call strategic behaviour, was actually created through storytelling in our part of the world, not through PowerPoint and Excel and spreadsheets and all that kind of thing. So when Kate and I met out in Lewis on another project, we thought, how's about we try and do some of this in the old way, where we do the latest strategic logic. I don't want to sound bumptious, but you know, I can do that. But we do it in a way that gets folk engaged in it, because one of the big problems with strategy is that it usually hangs together logically, but nobody actually does it. And quite often people say, yeah, I really get that, and I'm going to do it, and then they kind of do something more important or answer the phone. And so gradually the strategy dies a death of 1,000 cuts. There's a thing in strategy called implementation failure. Just to throw a wee scary statistic out, part of the reason we exist is that we're trying to deal with this idea of implementation failure, which is that about 20% of the time strategies are successfully executed, i.e. 80% of the time they're not. We thought, well, that's interesting. How do we deal with that? So strategy story to some extent is a response to that. So in a way we're very innovative, but in another way we're actually quite traditional, pre-traditional. Okay, so what is strategy? I'm going to start off by telling you a story. I'm not a brilliant storyteller, it's not my main strength, so hopefully you'll get the gist of this. And by the way, I've learned from Kate that the key thing in stories is never let facts get in the way of them, right? So I will have bent a few facts here just for dramatic effect. It doesn't matter, it's meant to illustrate things. I want to take you back. Any ideas, anybody think of somebody that is a total strategic legend, one of the strategists of all time? So it's three words. First word's a name, a boy's name. Last word is one syllable, rhymes with spate, and begins with
Alexander the Great.
Well done, right? Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is one of these strategists of all time. And believe it or not, a lot of traditional strategy, when it was first taught in businesses, which is only in the late 1960s at Harvard Business School, all the cases were military cases. And so a lot of the original ideas came from military engagements, but Alexander the Great was one of the benchmarks. So young guy, and he's about 20-ish, he inherited his father's empire. And he was a visionary or very ambitious. And he decided he wanted to make this a really big, brilliant, the best empire that's ever been. So he was very focused on fighting technology, the latest innovations, you know, how to stab you through the eye without anybody even noticing that you'd done it, all kinds of stuff he developed. And he was very successful. He went around basically winning lots of skirmishes and battles and enlarging his territory. And the big kind of guy in the region, Darius of Persia, was keeping an eye on him and beginning to get a little bit twitchy. And Darius actually Alexander inflamed Darius's anger by precipitating a battle with him, at which he had the audacity to kidnap Darius's wife and family and take them away. And I think he held them captive for a little while. Might even have been a year or two. So Darius was getting very, very annoyed and decided to squash this upstart once and for all. And they met at a thing called the Battle of Issus. Right, and I want to use this just to illustrate the key components of strategy. If you get this, you've got traditional strategy nailed. Dead easy. Right, so Alexander, according to the stories of the ancients, which in great storytelling fashion, apparently by current historians say have been totally exaggerated, but Alexander the Great arrived with about, to make the sums easy, 333,333 and a third people. And Darius of Persia, on the other hand, had about 1 million in his army. Right, so 1 million to about 33,000. That must strike you as quite daunting. It was reckoned that it was possible that Darius's army had a bigger cavalry than the whole of Alexander the Great's army. So again, no doubt an exaggeration, but the odds were considerably stacked against Alexander the Great. All right. So what they did was Alexander the Great gathered his generals. They got into the tent, big general's tent, and they had a kind of group huddle. They sent out some spies, do some reconnaissance work, assess the situation, come back with some information, and kind of this is what they said. Well, there's loads of them. We're dramatically outnumbered. They're on a little bit of a hill. We're kind of on a plain. There's no features here really except a bog. There's a big bog about a mile away, half a mile away, something like that. That's about all. It's a really good day, not a cloud in the sky, but we are in severe doo-doo here. We don't really know what we're going to do. So they had to think about it, and they thought, so that's the first bit of strategy. They were scanning the environment, trying to figure out what might happen when outside of them, out there, with competitors or with the weather or the landscape or whatever. Then they said, right, so what have we got relative to them? What have we got, all 33,333 and a third of us, relative to Alexander the Great? Is there anything collectively that we are, that's to our advantage? Any ideas? Shout them out if you fancy. If you don't, I'll just do it.
They were all soldiers.
All right, so they were soldiers, they were committed, they were well trained because it was a tight unit. What else? They were, as a unit, they were, rhymes with ball, starts with Smith. Small, relatively small. So what does that give them? Compared to this massive million people army, what does that give them?
Maneuverability.
Absolutely, maneuverability. You're good at this, James P. Maneuverability. So they got maneuverability, flexibility, agility, all these ilities, quite a lot of ilities. What else could they have? Rhymes with, paradoxically, the word rhyming begins with T.
Timing?
Timing, right? Success, secret of success in comedy, timing. So they've got timing, they could possibly precipitate this scrap. And then the other thing, and if you remember what was there in the environment, two things, cloudless day, what's up there in the sky?
Sun.
Sun was up in the sky. And somewhere on the ground there was a, rhymes with log.
Bog.
Bog. Right, so it's a bog. So this, what they then did was they used their flexibility and agility and maneuverability to shuffle. And they shuffled and shuffled and shuffled and shuffled and shuffled and shuffled. And they gradually get the massive army of Darius to shuffle with them. And they changed the site of the battle a little bit. Not by much, but a little bit. And they all assembled themselves in front of the
Bog.
Yep, so they assembled themselves in front of the bog. So at that point, they did probably, you know, the Braveheart thing. They all lifted their kilts and did provocative things. And eventually Darius said, right, charge. So they charged, the cavalry charged when the sun was at a particular point in the sky. Cavalry charged Alexander the Great's army. Guess what Alexander the Great then did, or what his army did, the front line did. You've maybe seen this in films, it's been copied. It became clear what they'd used some of the time that they had to do. They lifted their shields up, all in a big line. And they bounced what into what, or into where? They bounced
Sunlight.
a line of sunlight into the eyes of the horses. Okay? So the horses all then ran round the line of sunlight, the shields, into the
Bog.
into the bog. Thanks, James. So they run into the bog. What happens to horses in a bog? They get stuck. What happens to horses that get stuck when there's loads of guys with swords? This is a sad bit of the story. The horses didn't come out of the bog, right? So the cavalry of Darius was decimated. Massive big chant. Alexander the Great, great moral victory. Then, of course, certain things went wrong. All began to go a bit pear-shaped. Alexander the Great fell over, hurt his ankle. Tension began to rise. Is this all going to work or not? Will they get there? And then they performed the most famous military maneuver of all time. Any idea what they did? They formed into a something shape. They formed into an arrow shape, right? And what they then did was they all started marching towards Darius's tent. Okay? Any idea what they were chanting? They all started chanting. Oh, that's another resource they had, their voices. They all spoke the same language, but they were all shouting one thing. What do you think they're shouting? Any guesses? Right, so the second word was Darius. First word was... No.
Freedom.
Nearly. First word was kill. Kill Darius. So you end up with this massive arrowhead of people marching towards Darius' tent. Now Darius, being an intelligent chap, he's a very successful emperor, suddenly thought, hang on, the odds have turned from 33,000 to 1 against Alexander the Great's army to 33,000 to 1 against me, personally. The rate they're cutting these guys at the front of the arrow down, it will still be at my tent in 15 minutes. I am dead if I stay here. So what do you think he did? Famous Monty Python maneuver. He ran away. Right, so Darius ran away, fearing for his safety, quite sensibly, because he would have been dead. And it was at that point that it became clear that there was another big problem with with Darius's army. They were all conscripts. It was loads of different tribes. They didn't speak the same language. They had no idea what was happening. They had no strategic communications. So most of them liked it. And the ones that were left didn't fare very well. Thus ended the Battle of Issus, and a massive victory for Alexander the Great that kind of launched him into legends, really. Okay, so everybody get the story? Just a wee thumbs up if you've got the story so far. Thanks very much. That's good. If you want to read more about it, this is a plug from my book. In the run into Christmas, it should be in the bargain bucket of Waterstones for about 30 pence, with a free bag of crisps and a bottle of still water, which is just past its sell-by date. But the key thing here is that long before strategy, long before we get into strategy, we did an analysis of the situation, a kind of diagnosis. All right? And identified the challenge, which is we're greatly outnumbered. And then the strategy comes together. 3 bits: intent, kill Darius; foresight, the sun will be in the sky at a particular time; and capability, we're going to use our flexibility and our superior shiny shields and spears and all that kind of thing to win it. Okay, so that is strategy in a nutshell. It brings these 3 things together. First of all, the sequence, do some diagnosis, identify the challenge, and then get a good combination of foresight, capability, and intent, and you're halfway there to strategy. In fact, you're most of the way there to strategy. That's what strategy is. Strategy is no more complicated than that. It's very simple. All you need is these 3 things, intent, foresight, and capability, assembled in the right order, in the right way. Okay? So it's easy. And you should be able to write your strategy in 1 sentence. It can be a bit longer than kill Darius, but the idea that you need a 30-page document or a 50-page document is nonsense, not true. You might want a strategic plan that lays it out in glorious technicolor detail, but the actual strategy itself, everybody should remember it. Okay? Very succinct. The other thing, incidentally, this is where I become very controversial in university land and business school land, is that you don't actually need a strategy. Strategies don't belong to organizations. Strategies belong to challenges. Alexander the Great had a vision of a massive empire, but he had many strategies. Every time the challenge changed, he had a new strategy. So strategies belong to challenges, not to... they're not something that you have and it sits there and for 5 years, it's fine. Okay? I'm going to crack up the pace a little bit now. So you can glorify that. That's a little example of a strategy statement with these 3 things in the industry that I used to work in. Intent, foresight, and capability comes together. You can make it really glorious, 12 features. This is all good stuff, strategic logic. But it doesn't always come to fruition the way that you think. So just to end this little session, I'd encourage you to have a think about the challenges that your organization faces. And then just like Alexander the Great's statement, kill Darius. He knew that if they killed Darius, they'd have overcome the challenge, basically. What would it look like if you overcome that challenge? And then that's you one step towards the beginning of a conventional strategy, your statement of strategic intent. Okay, so if you like, take a couple of minutes just to make some notes in this session where you think about the challenge or opportunity. It doesn't need to be negative, by the way, it can be positive. Big opportunity we face is, and then imagine you've overcome it. What would that look like? And that's you got your statement of strategic intent. It's that easy. Okay, so is everybody with that so far? Good. So I'm just going to give you 2 minutes in case you want to jot down some notes, and then I'll move on.
Would it be all right if you just bring up the previous slide so I can...
Sorry, yeah, sorry.
Thanks
Jim.
very much.
Kate's going to tell me off in a minute because she tells me not to speak when people are trying to write, but I'm going to do it. The other consequence of what I've said, incidentally, is that no organisation needs to have only one strategy. That's also nonsense. It's become part of the managerial paraphernalia and fashion, but you might need more than one. You might have more than one challenge. Okie doke. So I'm going to move on from this slide now because we've got quite a lot to get through. And the longer I'll leave you.
There's just a quick question in the chat box. I don't know if you want to just quickly address that now. If you see that.
I can't see it actually. Would you mind telling me what it is?
So, bring it up. So it seems like Alex the Great's army all spoke the same language. Clubs, academies, governing bodies, home nations, and all that fund these pieces of the pie don't speak the same language. They want to speak different languages and have different needs and wants. How would you address this? This is from our kind of perspective as Snow Sports.
That is a fantastic question. So that is a fantastic question, and thanks to whoever asked it, because it also bridges into the next session. Because what is changing in strategy a little bit is that the emphasis is moving away from strategic logic to strategic communications. Alexander the Great's army was tight. They all knew what was going on. They had great communications. They all spoke the same language. Brilliant observation about Darius's army. They didn't have a good strategic communications thing. So the real question is, how do we deal with that? It's tough, right? But we are going to try and answer that question in the next session. So if you don't mind, we'll come back to that at the end of the next session. We need to get everybody on board. I was once at a conference in the States. I've been doing this academically for like 300 years, strategy. And one of the big guys in the States, a guy called Jay Barney, said, one of the questions I've got is, what would you rather have? A 90% strategy with 30% buy-in, or a 60% strategy with 90% buy-in? So the real issue with strategy is buy-in and understanding. And ultimately that boils down to communication. It's really difficult when different people speak in different languages. One of the things that we think unites them is taking the time and trouble to invest in a narrative that links everybody and where everybody can see and hear themselves. So a story is the bottom line.
Can I ask a supplementary question on that?
Yeah.
Who in the world, whether it's sporting context or business or charity, is applying that and doing that really well that I can go and have a look at?
Ooh. Can we come back to you on that? Can we just ponder that and come back to you by the end?
Sure. Thanks, Donald.
Great question as well. Yeah. Right. So, moving on. Introduction to story. My brilliant business partner, Kate, is somewhere. I can't actually see her. I'm sure you're there somewhere, Kate. So I'm going to ask you to talk through a little bit of the story side of things. The bottom line is strategy. The thing that I've just run through, if you do that, if you do an MBA course or something in strategy now, it's very analytical, it's broken down. You end up with this Humpty Dumpty thing where we've got all the pieces, but nobody actually knows how to put them back together again. And people in organizations through language and cultures and all that kind of thing end up split up in their little compartments. The thing that joins people back together again is story. That's why it's been the most powerful cultural thing for thousands and thousands of years. So what do we mean by story in relation to strategy? And Kate, if you're there, if you can hear me, we're in different rooms. Over to you.
Thanks, Donald. Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Hi, everyone. You're not going to hear very much from me today. This is Donald's gig, really, because we're obviously looking at the strategy side of things. But we did just want to explain a little bit more about why story is so important to our approach to strategy. And the whole thing about story for us, really, is that story brings people together. It helps people create meaning together. It helps us engage emotionally and buy into things and feel things. It's very different from, you know, quite often in organizations, a strategy comes down from on high. And I've certainly experienced it in different places where a strategy comes down and you kind of think, well, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily apply to what's happening on the ground here. You know, if they'd have talked to me a little bit more about this, I could have explained that this isn't going to work, or this could work better in this way. So we use story as a way to tackle that problem. Those great big strategies that come thump down on your desk and away you go, you're meant to go and do it, but actually it's not going to reflect the reality of what's going on in the ground. So the way we use stories, we go into organizations and work with folk on what their stories, opinions, perspectives are, what the reality on the ground is. And the way we do that is using storytelling techniques, and then we make with them mini programs, audio programs, video, and the whole process of people working together to create those stories together binds them into the strategy process and gets everybody on board and engaged. So for us, story is really about driving that engagement in the strategy from the very beginning so that it's got more chance of succeeding. So that's point one. Donald, could you flip through 2 slides for me, please? Donald's in control here. So this little diagram here explains our process in this sense. So we use story. We've got 3 kind of elements to our process when we work with folk. I've just talked you through story 1. We go out, we go gather the stories, we go gather the perspectives. And while we do that, we're training folk up in digital storytelling. So that's, you know, that's good. Everybody's kind of learning some stuff there. That's really good. That's really important in terms of getting to the point of being able to diagnose the situation and get to that point of setting those challenges that Donald referred to. So the whole story gathering element there is like, okay, so what's really going on here? Because we want to articulate some really clear challenges so that we can start the strategy work. Because you need the challenge and you need to be focused with your strategy. We then go back to story again. We then go back to the world of story, because there's no point having a really cracking strategy unless you're going to communicate it. So from that point, we move into another story dimension, which is, okay, so we've got this strategy now. So how are we going to communicate it? And that's where the strategic communication side of things comes in. So that's basically our approach to story. And for us, the most significant about story is a way of getting people together and engaging in a way that people are really familiar with. We all love to tell a good story, and we all love to hear a good story. It's in us. It's something that's always been in us. And it's something that we think plays a really important role. I think that's me on that, Donald. Yeah, afraid so.
The only thing I'm going to add something there, Kate, if that's all right. So remember the three things: intent, foresight, and capability. You know, the intent was to kill Darius. If you've got your own combination of intent, foresight, and capability, there's two ways you can get to that. One is you can get the board or a team of directors or whatever it is to come up with it conceptually. You know, the Old Testament way, as I call it, they go off up into the hills and then come back from the hills with tablets of stone and say, here is the new strategy, you all do it. Most of the time that doesn't work, but we'll just overlook that for a time. It was quite nice in the hills, a good laugh, but quite often it doesn't work. The other way that you can get to the same shape of intent, foresight, and capability is you can edit the stories of what people are already doing socially together. So what Kate does is she edits with the people their own stories so that you end up with the same logic, intent, foresight, and capability, but it's woven out of the stories of what people are actually doing. And of course, what folk don't tend to notice is that 80% of what they've told you is on the cutting room floor. So it's still a process of selection and editing, but it's just a different way of getting to strategy through the voices and experiences and ideas of the people who are actually going to make it happen. There is no implementation issue. We're starting from what we're actually already doing. This isn't an idea. This is just a refinement of what we're doing. So we call that social edit or socially editing. And we use all these things, blah, 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 and that's a story arc, blah, blah, blah. So that's the only thing I'd like to say on this is that if you think of most of the good stories, right, a really crap story is, once upon a time there was a guy called Donald. He was really good at what he did. He never did anything wrong, and then Donald lived happily ever after. Right, most of the strategy that you pick up actually reads like that. It's not strategy at all, it's spin. That's a completely different phenomenon. It's propaganda. Strategies deal with challenges, and therefore they have to have real difficulties that people see as impeding their progress being tackled. So a good story has got texture, it's got characters, it's got a plot line, but more than anything else, it's got attention. And so I think, again, with the kind of spin corporate version of strategy, quite often these difficulties and challenges are out of the way. And one of the very unfortunate things that's happening at the moment in the world is COVID, of course, and people are now being much more open about the challenges that we're facing because we can't really deny them. Wow. So that's strategy in a nutshell. And how do you get people on board? By editing the strategy out of what people are doing and saying, rather than going off into the hills and getting this abstraction and then saying to people, do that, because quite often they don't even get what you're saying. However, one of my favourite lines in one of Robert Burns' poems, in fact, my whole research career can be boiled down to two lines in Robert Burns' poems. The one that we've just been dealing with, story, is from a poem called To a Louse, where he was sitting in church, and one of the aristocrats, a lady, was sitting in front of him, and he noticed a louse crawling up the back of her coat, just on her neck and into her hair. And so he penned the words, part of the poem, obviously. Would some power the gift he gives to see ourselves as others see us? And that was this idea of telling a story that's got multi-voices and multiple angles, so that we're always thinking about how we appear, what we do, how we look, all that. It's very reflective. But the other big line is from another poem that sounds like To a Mouse, To a Louse, but it's To a Mouse. Any idea what the line might be from a strategy point of view? Some strategy up, really. Became the title of a Steinbeck novel just about. the best laid schemes of mice and men, gang, aft, a gley. Right, so that's why the 80-20 kind of thing happens, that quite a lot of the time, strategies, 80% of the time, strategies are not implemented because something else takes over.
Donald, just a question on the chat function. So someone's asking, what if there is either an absence of strategy or the strategy is flawed? We would want to change that, but couldn't just go off what people are already doing.
I know this sounds like a really copy-outy answer, but we're just about to talk about that as well, because what we're actually going to talk about is the way strategy really happens, which is an emergent pattern. Quite often because people are doing things that are in inverted commas not scripted or wrong or inappropriate given what's going on in the environment. Okay, so we're getting into a different view of strategy, not as the mechanical execution of an intellectual plan, but as the real-time improvisation of something, a pattern between people. It's completely live. And of course, we've got intellectual structures to help guide it, but it's a live improvisation. So I think this will answer that question. That's the traditional view of how you implement strategy, really. You get the strategy, you structure it, you do all that, blah, blah, blah. That's just general management. Everybody knows it, project management. Okay? It's rational, linear, controlled. These are all the hallmarks of a good manager. You think things through, orderly. But the root metaphor of that is the machine. Right, it's a mechanical thing. And one of the unfortunate consequences of thinking in this way is that what you're doing is you're styling the organization as something that's controllable, predictable, behaves itself, does exactly what it's meant to do when it's meant to do it, or in other words, is dead. Right? Because the characteristic of something alive, back to the story, you know, Donald was a completely normal person who never put a foot out of step and got everything right. No. Things that are alive because they grow, they do unusual things, they're interesting, they've got surprises in them, they innovate, come up with stuff. And so one of the big questions is, how do we deal with strategy when we know that that's true? In all our other social settings, you don't go down to the pub with a script. If you've got a game of football going on, you've not got every single move charted out, it's emerging. And there are strategies. Sports people know this, you know this better than me. There are strategies, but they are not the scripted version that appears as strategy in textbooks. We're dealing with a much more complex, adaptive, and emergent dynamic. So in reality, quite often, the carefully crafted plan ends up, second box there, wee thing off to the side, in the bin. I'm going to skip this story because I'm just noticing the time and we are beginning to kind of run out of time. But this is what, long ago when I was a researcher, a scientific researcher, I spotted two lasers doing something which they should not have been doing. And I suddenly thought, well, hang on, the world is not actually dancing to my script here. Took it away to a scientist and he said, they're doing something on their own, these two lasers. They are self-pulsing. What? They're talking to one another in a way that you didn't design them to do. They're self-organizing. Anybody seen one of these? What's the word for that?
A flock?
Yeah, it's a flock. So it's a flock.
Murmuration.
It's a murmuration, yeah. So it's a flock of starlings. I actually stopped at the side of the M6 once because I saw this and I genuinely thought I was seeing a UFO. I had no idea what it was first time I saw it. I was mesmerized by it. We don't have time to play a video version, but anybody YouTube starlings, a murmuration of starlings, or fish shoaling, all that kind of thing, it's absolutely gobsmackingly beautiful. The interesting thing about them is they're constantly expressing a dynamic order that isn't out of control, but it hasn't been scripted. Ant colonies, beehives, all these kind of things, they don't have designs. So what is it that these things have? How is a swallow murmuration different from a shoal of fish? And the answer is because they're different forms of complex adaptive system or process. And the thing that distinguishes them is they have, this is a bit, we're getting a wee bit abstract here, but I'm going to labour it. We have different sets of order generating rules. So the rules in a flock, somebody used the word flock, if you Google a thing called the Boyd's algorithm, B-O-I-D-S, it shows you equally sophisticated flocking behavior, and it's generated by 3 rules, right? That the birds in the flock follow. The first rule is follow the bird in front of you. The second rule is stay equidistant from the 2 birds on either side of you. And the third rule is if something strange happens, always fly towards the center of gravity of the flock. It's 3 rules. And they generate all these patterns. These patterns are different every single time, just like families are different every single time, just like no 2 games of football are identical, no 2 fires are the same. They're always different, but you still know a fire is not a football match, or a flock of starlings is not a shoal of cod. You can tell they're different, but they've got a pattern. So our view is that that's what strategy is like. The culture of the organization is generating this pattern all the time. Part of that pattern are plans and strategies, but it's not really, the plans and strategies are not where the strategy comes from. They come from the operation of these deep rules. It's like the grammar of a language. And if you really want to manage strategy in a non-traditional way, especially when things are changing, figure out what the order generating rules, the deep rules, or the term that we use for this, the deep structure of your organization is. Have you heard so my research for 25 years has been about can we manage emergence in human settings? What happens when you get things like willpower? You know, I don't want to diss bees and ants because I really like them, but maybe they're not bent on creating empires or bombing one another to quite the same extent that we are. What happens when you give people human capabilities? Can we manage emergence? Can we do organizations, the big flocks of people, have the same kind of dynamic? So we set up a network to look at this. We had big players, the BBC was one of them, Unilever, the National Health Service. They were all interested because what we were getting at was that it's possible that innovation and the constant dynamism of the organization has been throttled by conventional management, and every organization's got its own form of hidden order that we're constantly trying to suppress with management. And the reason that we do that is because when management as a technology was invented, it was invented in a time where the success of the organization was predicated on everybody doing exactly what they were meant to do at exactly the right time in exactly the right way, i.e. they were running the vast assembly lines that characterized the beginning of the industrial age. And the profitability of these firms was determined by utilization of fixed capital. So you didn't want anybody innovating. You didn't want flexibility. You wanted everything to behave itself. Now most organizations are saying, yeah, that's behind us. What we need is the best out of our people. We need everybody to be contributing. Our competitive advantage is voluntarily imparted or voluntarily withheld. We need to work with people. So we've now got a big collection of people. This stuff might follow the same kind of dynamics. We might have our own hidden order, and our job as managers is to steward it, not strangle it. To capitalize on it and harness it, not kill it off by stripping all the interconnects and getting everybody to do exactly what I think they should do. So the question then becomes, how do you do that? And I think we'll just get to this and probably end. Our view of this was, can we tap into that kind of order? Yes. It's actually simpler than you think. We've all got experience of it. So most people, especially folk like yourselves who are acquainted with sports, Most people have got experience of emergence in every day of their life. I've used a few examples, you know, conversations, they're emergent. They're not out of control. They're not completely unpredictable, but they're certainly not scripted unless you're sad. A game of football. So what are the deep rules of a game of football? Sorry to use that analogy, it's one of the few that I know. The deep rules are things like, right, there's 11 of us and 11 of them. We're trying to get the ball through that rectangular thing at the other end. They've all got on one colour, we've got on another colour. Oh, and we have to abide by the formal rules of the game. That's it. And there's transformation. Everybody's heard the kind of rural or urban myth that a new game arose. Transformation occurred when one guy playing football decided to run with the ball, pick it up and run with it. Now that probably is a myth, but it's a good one, because that's exactly how transformation occurs. That's how deep structure in these emergent complex systems gives you new strategic patterns. You change one or two rules right at the heart of the organization, way down below the surface. You can't manage emergence in the surface, but you can tweak the deep structure. And you can see, for example, in many organizations at the moment, there's been a significant tweak to deep structure occasioned by COVID, where people are saying, right, you don't need to come into the office because you can't. It's now legitimate for you to work at home, and we'll do a lot of stuff by Zoom. That's a good example of a whole new organizational format and strategy beginning to emerge around a tweak, as simple as that. These tweaks can be exceptionally significant, exceptionally light-handed. And again, if you involve people socially through the kind of stuff that Kate does, in imagining the tweaks together and then agreeing them, the management involved in that is much smaller. Again, think of yourself involved in an emergent conversation or an emergent game of football. There's a lot of stuff done in terms of learning set pieces and, you know, reflecting in the dressing room. Donald, you should have scored that penalty, that was pathetic. But generally, they're not managerially heavy, because the order is continually generating and renewing itself. So the three stages of strategic transformation in this non-traditional view, very simple. The deep rules, first thing, first of all, try and excavate, identify your own deep structure. What are the basic rules of the game, the rules of thumb that generate your organization? What are your flocking rules? There's probably 5 or 6 of them. Some of them will be decision rules. We only do this, we don't do that, we don't do that kind of thing. And some of them will be boundary rules. They're in, they're out, they're the kind of people we deal with. And some of them will be action rules. Okay? And then do some scenarios. We want to be like this. We're bored with being like that. We're boring, we're fed up with ourselves. We want to be a new, brilliant, different organization. So you imagine the kind of rules that they would have, like the way rugby came out of football. We want to be able to carry the ball. It's better, it's easier, it's a lot easier. So you imagine a new set of rules, and then you just say, right, there's the old rules, there's the new rules, we're going to do a switch. And we've all agreed that, haven't we? Then this is the hard bit. This is the hard bit. So we've done a lot of this, and this is the bit that everybody says, yeah, we'll do that. And then they don't, because they're scared, is the bottom line. Because this takes you into the unknown territory. This is the resetting is the bit that keeps the starlings moving all the time. So what that means is the mechanistic structures in your organization, some of them you destroy, you tear up, to put it a more positive way, you bring more people into contact with each other. And that again will be happening in COVID through Zoom and all that kind of stuff. People are connected, they're connected to one another in a sufficiently rich way to make the old mechanical thing history. So you reorganize, you restructure, you develop a new story, you imagine new scenarios, you whip it up, You shake it up, you keep it moving, you keep it alive. You're not a mechanism. You cannot make an omelette without breaking the eggs. You break the eggshells. It's that simple. You cannot change if you don't change. How obvious is that? And then the third thing is refocus. Change the focus on what you talk about. Instead of fixing all the things that are wrong, which you've got to do, that's just sensible general management. Also, focus on sharing stories of unexpected innovations that have turned out really well. You might have seen it happen in another organisation. You might have seen it in telly. You might have tried a wee experiment. You might have a colleague that did. And wow, that worked. That's called asset-based development, right? It's called technically positive feedback. It's the thing that gives rise to viral change or viral processes in the internet. It's the amplifying feedback that makes things change. Negative feedback, the restoring feedback, is the feedback that keeps everything exactly the way the script thinks it should be. Different kind of feedback. So you still have to do that. We still need to have some things that are under control. They're ridiculous to think otherwise. You know, I don't want to go along to maternity unit and say, right, I'm here to pick up my baby, and they say, well, I think it's that one. Right, so I want certain things to be very well controlled and regulated, but there are other things which are about innovation and change that can't be done in that way. So you need a different process, this emergent stuff, where you're amplifying the unexpected, sharing it, and building and growing through some of these innovations and often happy accidents, actually. And that, again, is where story comes back in. It comes back in because it connects people. We share things that are really good or really bad. The reason that tribes across the world for thousands and thousands of years have had bards and shamans and storytellers is because we have evolved through that process. Good things are shared through story. Look at television, look at Netflix, look at all these, look at the effort that we put into things like Facebook and social media. Everybody knows it, but it's a really important part of strategy as well. We don't know in advance everything good that's going to happen, but when it does, we need to do clever strategic communications to make sure that we harvest it and we share it. So that's a non-traditional approach to amplifying strategic change in a kind of complex, emergent way. And I think at that point, I've probably talked for long enough. I'd like to thank those of you whose eyes are still open for keeping them open for this long, because I know it must be pretty dry sitting listening to all this stuff. Kate, would you like to add anything?
No, I'm all good actually. I'm good, thank you.
Everybody's looking slightly bemused. Was that rubbish and bewildering?
I'm sure it wasn't, Don. There's a couple of questions that came up, and if it's all right, I'll just jump back to those, if that's okay.
I'll maybe just briefly audio-wise explain what I was writing earlier. I am doing an MBA, so a lot of what you're talking about is familiar territory for me, and recently read Frederic Laloux's Reinventing Organizations, where he begins the book by talking about spiral dynamics and how, you know, you're talking about the machine metaphor, and I'm assuming you're going towards the greener teal-based organization side of things. I was just asking if that's where you were going with it, is you see this sort of machine or red or whatever color scheme you want to go with. I forget, it was ultraviolet or something, whatever, it's irrelevant what color he chooses. But you're talking about trying to bring a more flat organizational structure into place. Is that kind of where you were going with it, or is that just an aside to really what you were actually saying?
No, it's not an aside. It's necessary conditions to have good emergent strategy managed all the time, James. So it's not an aside. You're spot on with that. Yes, a flatter organisation, not always flatter, and yes, an organisation that I think what we're fundamentally saying is a more natural organisation. That human beings are intelligent and capable folk, and if we connect ourselves properly and spend the time talking to one another and crafting stories together like we do in every other dimension of our life, organisation becomes a more enjoyable and more productive experience. So in general, we're saying a more natural organisation where we readmit some of the things that have been binned, frankly, by the machine age. So at work, you're not meant to be emotional. You're not meant to be subjective. You're not meant to be a human being, really, because these are all the fundamental characteristics of human beings. So we're asking for human beings and our experience to be put at the centre of how we think about strategy, not the idea that we're some parts of a machine, which is actually humiliating, and we think ultimately just sells everybody short.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? The ones that have come through the chat have sort of been addressed as they've come up, so quite happy to use the time we have. If there's any other questions that want to come through. No? Going, gone?
I think there's one more in the chat there.
There's a comment made, it's more a comment. An individual is trying to save Scotland's outdoor education centre estate for future generations. Reimagine and reset has been forced upon us and eggs are broken.
What did he say? Say the end of that again, Trafford?
Reimagine and reset has been forced upon us. The eggs are broken.
Yeah, absolutely right. So this stuff that we've just been talking about, published in the Strategic Management Journal, biggest strategy journal in the world, about 15, 20 years ago. And the thing that we could not get people to do was the reset. People would do the reimagine, but the reset is the hard bit, because it means tearing up existing structures occasionally and taking a leap of faith. We used to illustrate some of this through outdoor education. We had an arrangement with Glenmore Lodge, and we took people up into a burning spate somewhere near Kincraig, and we wanted everybody to get an experience of the leap of faith, because to some extent, to go into this broken creativity, it's a bit anxious for many people in managerial conditions, because for part of it, you're not in control in the traditional sense. So the thing that's happened now is that has been, as the person who asked the question has very saliently pointed out, that has been done for us. So if there was ever a time to transform, it is now. That's the hard bit, and it's been taken out of our hands. So the question is whether you get on, to switch metaphors, it's whether you get onto that wave and ride it or resist it. The resisting it is going to be tough.
Again, another comment that's come through: strategy is fine and being creative, but the physical aspects may now be the key driver to sustainable strategy.
I'm not sure I quite, say that again?
Fiscal aspects rather, not physical.
Oh yeah, fiscal, yeah. Well, that's absolutely true. Yeah, that is true. So, and I think so one of the real problems, this is a slightly more academic point, one of the problems in organizations, I think, is that strategy, people are really beginning to get the idea of strategy as an emergent phenomenon. It was kicked into motion in the late 1970s by a guy called Henry Mintzberg. And our work, we would class ourselves as kind of neo-Mintzbergian. So it's happening in management. Where it isn't happening yet is in governance. So governance is all about control, predictability, accountability, understandably, because these are multiple stakeholder organizations that are quite often spending public money. And these two managerial mindsets are clashing. We haven't solved that problem yet. It's a biggie. It's a real biggie, possibly the biggest, actually.
Can I expand the sort of question that's relating to that then? So if you've got the governance structures that measure things on, for example, winning medals, how can you then demonstrate the throughput of the lower bit of the pyramid in a sporting context, i.e. the pathway as I call it, and how do you measure the threshold of commitment of individuals and athletes or participation numbers through storytelling? Other than saying we've got 1,000 likes on social media, on Facebook, is there any ways that you've come across on that? So we can blend that governance structure that's all about ranking tables, etc., further down. How do we win that argument? Do you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do. I've never thought about it in this context, and I'm slightly on the back foot with it.
Sure, I get that.
But I do get it, to be honest, in it's a version of a problem or an issue or a challenge that's coming up in a lot of places, because basically what happens is when people don't know how to control and manage the production of, say, something like medals, or it could be anything, some other performance measure, when they don't know how to control the production of it, what they then do is measure it and rank it. And so that's the governance response to it, is measurement. And I think, unfortunately, there's that old saying that all that counts can't be counted. The thing about measurement is it happens too late. And so the obsession and fetish, if that's not too strong a word, with measurement is no substitute for the deep-pocketed investment much further upstream. And I think the only way that can be dealt with is by finding success stories and sharing them as effectively and as professionally and with as much impact as is possible, not forgetting to tease the lessons and the learnings out of them for people in a way that make them digestible and believable and compelling. We've lost the art.
Yeah.
Can I just add in here, Donald, actually, that if I've picked up the question correctly, in order to kind of build that picture of commitment, like we've worked with organizations where we help coach them to build a bit of storytelling practice into their general meetings and all these sorts of things. So you're constantly reviewing what those success stories are, and people are feeding them in on a weekly basis or something like that. And then that becomes a vehicle in order to gather those stories and then turn them into content that's shared around and people discuss, and you build that picture.
So in a way, I think that there's one of the things, somebody asked a question earlier on, if you get any examples of organizations that are doing that, and I'm still kind of trying to think about that one, and I'm not coming up with one, but I would say that there's a trend that we're noticing, which is that in successful organizations, there's an increasing amount of money being spent on strategic communications. And it's kind of shooting up the managerial priority list. People are realizing that telling stories and sharing successes and all that kind of thing is key. I mean, it is really, really important. That people are really good and motivated. You just need to connect through stories of the right things. We have really whistled through this. I hope it wasn't incomprehensible. I've been working with complexity theory for such a long time that it's kind of second nature to me, but I know it's a bit, it's not always that easy to get your head around. I'm genuinely not trying to sell any material. There is more in the book. We are here, Kate and I are here. If any of you have got any more specific questions that you'd like dealt with or you'd like to chat with us at some point in the future, it doesn't need to be now, just get in touch with us. I think I've tried to put our contact details they're on the bottom of that slide.
We also, sorry, Trevor, because we have whistled through this quite quickly, we'd like to follow up with a couple of worksheets that might help that we went through in the session today that you can go away with, and perhaps a couple of video clips that maybe explain things a little bit better, because we haven't had really time to go through all of that. I hope to send that out following this session. If you're interested.
Suppose the anxious and insecure person in me I'd like to at least get some register from folk that at least part of it made some sense. So I'll just run you through what we've dealt with. We dealt with the traditional side of strategy, this idea of bringing intent, foresight and capability and getting a plan. That's the first thing. keeping that really succinct and tight, and starting off by getting your statement of strategic intent sorted. Then we went into this, I would say, much more contemporary view of strategy, which is about complex and emergent patterns in organisation managed through stories and storytelling. And I wouldn't mind just a wee thumbs up from at least the people I can see, to let us know that that message, that we at least get that message across. Because if we didn't, we need to do something. We've got a lot of work to do. All right, well, that's encouraging.
Good selection of thumbs up there, Donald.
Thanks, that's good.
Thank you.
It's quite difficult doing this with Zoom. Usually when you're in a room, you can read people, and if they're telling you to kind of quietly shut up, you can get that, you can pick it up. It's not so easy to do that on Zoom. So forgive my insecurity.
That's part of the new strategy.
Exactly. I'm still getting to, yeah.
I think the worksheets would be really welcomed as well, Kate. I think Cobble said that they would really be helpful. So I can send them out if you could pass them on to us.
Super, we'd be very happy to do that.
I was trying to type in the chat unsuccessfully. So what I was saying was, if you've got outside funders who've still got the kind of Fordyism mentality, and you're using this more innovative stuff, do they look on it as being indiscriminate firefighting? And how do you overcome that?
Well, so that's really interesting. They can look at it as indiscriminate firefighting, possibly, or winging it, right? There's two things here. One is that partly depends on the relations between the management system and the organisation, or the people, the managers, and the governance structures, and what kind of dialogue they have between them, and the role of this kind of stuff. So if you can explain to them that that's what you're going to do, and it is a slightly experimental approach and all that kind of thing, sometimes that reassures them enough to say, okay, at least in this soft play area, you can try out some of that stuff. But the last thing that the regulatory frameworks around organisations want is a big surprise, especially if it doesn't work. And quite often when you're taking these experiments, there is a risk of that. So I think it needs to be a really close conversation. But I would like to get back to one other thing about strategy. What is the measure of strategy really? Well, again, as you sports folks would know, it's about investing over a long time in superior capabilities. Right, there is no cop-out there. It doesn't matter whether you do that in a traditional strategic planning mindset or whether you do it emergently. There has to be an accumulation and a cumulative development of specific skills and abilities. So that does mean that somehow or other, again, with your governing systems, you need to get their confidence in investment. And that's the reason I'm saying this, is that differentiates it from the firefighting thing. There has to be proactive investment in specific things. That is a strategy thing. That strategy ultimately is about resource allocation and priority. And there is no way of getting out of that, as far as I know.
So can I just say something else? So with COVID, I'm hoping that the world's waking up a bit to how science works, and the fact that science isn't linear and it isn't predictable, and it works on all the stuff that just happens from the outside, and the right people putting these two things together. Yeah. Do you think that that will help to inform this kind of structure that you're talking about?
Yes, as an executive summary, my answer is yes. I think what's going on in the world is going to waken a lot of people up to the fact that we are emerging from the age of mechanism. And an age when we're all split up and put in compartments and there's lines drawn left, right and centre, it is not working anymore. So I think, Angela, hopefully, fingers crossed, people are waking up to that.
Thank you.
Don and Kate, there's lots of really positive comments coming through. And so that should be reassuring for you. Your session has been well received. I'd just like to finish, I guess, by saying a huge thank you to you both for giving up your time voluntarily. to share your thoughts, your ideas. I'm sure it's been thought-provoking, and will definitely provide further thought. So once again, thank you both. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. And can we reciprocate actually and say thanks to you all? And we think what you are doing is fantastic. It's great. It's a great privilege for us to be able to contribute in a very small way to a much bigger, brilliant thing that you're all doing. So thanks very much. I am not a brilliant skier, but I do enjoy it. I'm rubbish. My sons are much better than me. And thanks for everything that you make possible for us. It really is brilliant.
Thank you very much, Don. And Neve, I believe you want to quickly run a poll just to provide some feedback around how people found tonight.
Yeah, it's just a really quick poll for us. We'll be sending out a more formal feedback sheet once we've had all our summit sessions, but this is just a quick thing, kind of a quick feedback thing.
You're still here yet?
Can we go at this point?
Do we have to do the poll too?
You can definitely do the poll. No, it's just a quick sum up of the session for us, but we'll send more formal feedback. But that would be great.
We'll get snap results. It'll only take a few seconds, and then the poll will come back.
This is like a Eurovision Song Contest. I'm nervous.
Great Britain, nil point.
Yeah.
You can't give 0. No, it's not possible. I'm just kidding.
So this is a beautiful thing about emergence and the emergent strategy. It's completely live. We cannot run it. We can't run away. We're compelled by what's happening at the moment.
Perfect. That's great. Thanks for everyone filling that in. Really appreciate it.
So Neve, you've got the results of this now, have you?
Yep.
So you know.
I do know. It's very, very, very positive.
Very good. Well, everyone, thank you again for your participation, and if you're joining us for the next session, look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.